this is the second time for Ibu Diana join with READI project. So welcome Ibu Diana. And for today we have, I will start with the what is it, housekeeping issue. First, please display your name with this format like Iksan or Muhammad Iksan _ and then followed by your university, just example. Already do not have a university. And then please your audio keep mute during the session unless you have a question later on. We will provide you with a system called raise your hand, like that. And then if you have a question during the session, you can put you can type in the chat room, but please provide a number in each your question, like 1, 2, 3, from, for example, from Pak Ato, question 1, and then followed by Pak Ruhiat or Ibu Novi and so on. Just put a number there so Ibu Diana can see which question in which the statement just saying hello to others. So we can, I mean, the facilitator, the moderator or host can recognize which are the question statements. So it's easier for us to identify. And also, for example, for those who got internet disconnection, know which one is the question already answered. And at the end, we will provide you a survey about the workshop. It's just like an evaluation workshop as usual. We will be sent to your chat room, in our chat room today. So that's the short housekeeping. And the next one, I will invite Pak Bill to provide welcoming remark. Pak Bill, time is yours.
Okay, terima kasih Pak Iksan. Selamat pagi kepada semuanya, and good evening to Diana. Thanks for joining us, Diana. It's wonderful to have you. It sounds like we're going to work mostly in English today. I'm sure we are, but maybe I'll give a few opening comments in bahasa Indonesia. Jadi kami senang sekali Ibu dan Bapak bisa bergabung bersama kami, bersama Ibu Diana pada pagi ini untuk webinar ini dengan fokus pada assessment yang efektif dan otentik untuk online learning. Tentu saja ini merupakan topik yang cukup penting, sangat masa kini ya untuk kita semua. Mungkin seperti Bapak dan Ibu ingat, sudah agak lama proyek READI mendorong online learning. Ada beberapa alasan kami mendorong itu. Salah satu adalah karena kami merasa ini merupakan trend untuk masa now. Tapi dengan adanya pandemi ini, mau tidak mau, untuk seluruh tingkat pendidikan, kita harus menggunakan metode remote, metode daring ini. Dan tentu saja ada beberapa tantangan, tapi ada banyak keuntungan juga. Jadi pada hari ini, Bu Diana akan fokus pada bagaimana kita bisa menilai pencapaian mahasiswa-mahasiswa secara otentik atau nyata dan juga efektif. And Diana actually has quite a lot of experience doing this. She's taught some large groups of students using online learning techniques. And as she was saying earlier, she's a statistician, so she also looked at how people did when the exams were not proctored, were not, what we say, the supervisi, and also when they were completely online. And she has some interesting results, which I'm sure she will explain. So it's great, and many of you know Diana, you know her from before, so we're really, really happy to have Diana back with us. She's always got lots of enthusiasm, and as many of you may know, she's won awards for her teaching skills at the University of Waterloo, so she's really an ideal person to have to do this workshop. So we're pleased that so many of you have registered, and again, we're happy that Diana is staying up late, probably has maybe put her kids to bed, and she's working the night shift now. Thanks to Pak Iksan for putting all the work into designing this, and to the READI team behind the curtains. We're running all the technical things. So we look forward to a good workshop, and sekali lagi selamat bergabung, selamat datang kepada semuanya, and I hope it's a really useful and interesting webinar, which I'm sure it will be. Sekian dulu, terima kasih Pak Iksan.
Thank you, Pak Bill, for your welcoming remark. And as Pak Bill said earlier, today we will have Ibu Daina to facilitate this workshop. And I think I will not stay any longer with this. So now it is your turn, Ibu Daina. Please welcome Ibu Daina.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Is my volume all right? Okay, fabulous. So I'm going to share my screen here. I think this will work. Yes. Can you see my slide? Fabulous. Okay. I'm going to just move this over here a little bit so I can see your lovely faces. Oh, okay. There we go. Fabulous. Okay. Oh. I say I do this a lot. I really do. There we go. Okay. So thank you so much, Pak-Iksan and Pak Bill, for the lovely introduction. I don't really need to say any of this because you said it all. I'm a continuing lecturer at Waterloo. I've been teaching for coming up on 13 years and won several awards. And I'm currently the director of the MAXI program, where I see several people in the audience who have done it or will be doing it very soon. I talk a lot about teaching practice in various conferences and write about teaching on my blog, and I'll send you a link to that as well. And I had the pleasure of coming to Indonesia, to Bogor last year in November, and I met several of you, and it was wonderful. So I'm really happy to see so many familiar names and familiar faces. And excited to talk to you today. The world is very, very different from what it was even only less than a year ago when I saw you all in November. But a lot of the things I said then will still apply. And I will hopefully give you some ideas for how to incorporate assessment in an authentic and effective way into your online courses now that everything is a little bit different. So just a quick outline of what I want to speak to you about today. I just want to talk about the principles of effective online learning. This is going to be shorter than you might think. Talk a little bit about how to create connections with and amongst your students with online teaching. And then I'll move to the main part of the presentation, which is talking about assessment. So I'll talk about 3 different kinds of assessment. We can have diagnostic, formative, or summative. I want to also share a little bit about some reasons why students might cheat. That was definitely something that was mentioned as a concern for lots of faculty, both you folks and in Waterloo, and probably every institution. People are worried about students' honesty. So I have some information on how you can possibly address that. And then we'll talk about 8 different techniques that I've chosen that can be used in the online environment. If you ever have any questions, I would be very happy for you to either put them in the chat, and then I'll get to them when I take a little break here and there. When I'm taking a break for questions, you can also just say your question out loud if you prefer that. That's fine. So we'll work on that when we get there. So I'll pause for questions a few times so you don't have to hold on to them until the very end. And then of course, I'll have lots of time for questions at the end. So any questions before we start? I have all of your faces on a different screen. So when I look sideways, I'm looking at you. And when I look here, I'm not looking at you. It's kind of weird. I'm sure you're used to that too if you've ever done anything synchronous online. Okay, so let's get going. So my principles of effective online learning is actually very short. In my mind, there are really only 2 principles that you need to think about. And a lot of things fall under both of these categories, but I think the 2 principles that are most important are engagement and assessment. If you have material that the students are engaging with, if they're interacting with the material, they're interacting with each other, they're interacting with the instructor, and you have assessments that are aligned with that material. So you're assessing the students on the things you want them to know, and in a variety of different ways. Then I think those are the ingredients for success. I don't think you need much more than those two things. So number 3 is, there is no number 3. If you have engagement and you have assessment, I think that's all you need. If you have a good delivery on both of those things. So, I mean, students are in a crazy situation. You're all in a crazy situation. Everyone is dealing with upheaval in their world. And if you can hold on to these two things of having engaging material and fair and variety of assessments, then you guys and your students will be okay. So I want to talk first about engagement and then later a little bit more about assessment. So when we're talking about engagement, I can think of sort of 3 different ways that that can look. So the most obvious, of course, is creating connections between the students and the material. So that's going to raise some questions like, how do you deliver the material? I've been told that often you'll have a mix of synchronous and asynchronous delivery of material. So there might be some videos or some readings for the students to do, but then you also might have times where you are talking directly to your students at the same time. Both of those are great. There is no right way to do it. And if you're hoping that I'm going to tell you the right way, I'm sorry to disappoint you. There is no right way. Anything works, and it's going to depend on the context of the course, how many students you have, everyone's schedules. You know, students are dealing with lots of things as well. You don't know what their situation is. So there's no right answer to the best way to deliver material. But if you do something that works for you and for your students, then that's great. It's nice to have a balance if you can, with some synchronous and some asynchronous, but sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes it's all asynchronous. Maybe sometimes it's all synchronous. It works, whatever works. So again, that's the idea of making students connect to the material. A really important thing with that is to sort of keep the material current. So have students think about what's going on in the world right now and how maybe that can connect to the course. If they can see connections between the material and their own personal lives, that's true anytime, not just now, but that's extra true right now. If you can see, have the students see why the material they're learning is relevant to their daily lives, then that's going to be a really good way for them to connect with that material. The next category, I guess, would be student-instructor connections. So that's the kind of thing that's very, very difficult online. If we're so used to going into the classroom and seeing our students day after day after day, it becomes really tough to make that same connection when you're only talking to people through a screen, or maybe not even talking to them directly at all. So that was really, honestly, one of the hardest things for me when I started teaching online, was I missed my students. I really did. I would love to be there with you folks now and come back, but that's not the reality we live in. So having some sort of connection, it takes much more work, but I think it is still really important to do that. So a few different ideas for how you can create connections between the instructor, yourself, and your students. One very simple thing is just to have an intro video and have an introductions sort of page. So, you know, make a quick introduction video of yourself saying like, hello, introducing yourself, saying a little bit about yourself and your background, and what you hope your students will learn from the course. Just have like a quick little intro. So it's the first thing they see when they join your course. Also having maybe a discussion board post or some other way for the students to introduce themselves to you. And you can sort of say, oh, hey, cool, that's also my favorite show. Or, you know, have a question that, you know, something that's not necessarily academic related, just to create that social connection between you and the students. It's also really important to have consistent communication between you and the students. And this could be something as simple as every week, there's just, you know, an email that goes out from you to the students reminding them what they need to do this week for your course. And that sounds like a lot of work, but you could just write those emails and like a form basically, and just copy and paste them every week and just change the details. You can even pre-write them all and schedule them to go off at the beginning of each week. So just, you know, reminding them of dates, reminding them of assignment due deadlines, and all of those kinds of things. Those are the kinds of things you would normally do in class. Like you would see your students and, you know, just as they're going to pack up their bags for on Friday, you say, oh, don't forget on Monday you have a quiz. There is that aspect of connection is gone. So it's really important to try to preserve that in a more formal way. So having a little reminder of like, don't forget this week you need to do this and this and this. Doesn't have to be long, and you can just blast it out to everybody every week. I think erring on the side of more communication is better than less. Lastly, again, from the student's perspective, something that they're going to miss is the connections they make with their classmates. It's hard for us, of course. We miss our colleagues, we miss our students, but they miss each other as well. And so it's really important as well to create some kind of connection between the students, relating to the material, but also not relating to the material, also socially. So I think both are important. So lots of different ways you can do that. I definitely encourage the use of maybe a discussion board. If you have something like that, could use something within a learning management system if your university has one, or Slack, or, you know, there's a million different tools that you can use for conversations between people. So whatever tool you and your students are used to using and comfortable with, then that's great. There's not one perfect tool, it's whatever makes the most sense for the context. So again, having, you know, a question of the week of like, what's your favorite movie and why? Or, you know, what's your favorite fruit? Or what's a new recipe you've learned how to cook in the pandemic, or whatever, who knows? Just having something where people can share little bits of information about themselves. And then also relating to the course material, facilitating discussions of the course material outside of class time. So, you know, if someone has a question, encouraging other students to answer it, or even having people, lots of people responding to the same prompts from the instructor. So all of those three things, material connections to the students, instructor connections to the students, and student connections to each other, I think are really important in an effective online course. And again, it doesn't take a lot of work. A small amount of effort will make a big difference in terms of creating that sense of connection within the class, and the students will be more motivated and more engaged and involved in the course if they feel a connection to the material, to you, and to each other. So I think I'd like to pause now. If there are any questions that have come in, I'm going to sneak a peek in the chat. Nothing new yet. But if you have a second and you have a question about what I've talked about so far, please go ahead and either raise your hand and ask, or type into the chat box. I'm not sure how long to wait. So I think I don't see anything. If you do think of something, again, please don't be shy. Please type it in, or raise your hand, and I will happily pause. I can't tell if I can see any raised hands. No, I don't see any raised hands. Okay. Alrighty, so I'm going to keep going, but please, if you have any questions, please feel free to stop me. So the next thing I want to talk about is assessment. And I sort of have three things to say about it: the different types of assessment, different levels at which you can assess student knowledge, and then some principles for good assessments. And then I'll move into my 8 different possible types of assessments that you can use. So in general, I sort of like to think of there being 3 types of assessments, roughly based on when they occur in the student learning process. And these 3 categories are diagnostic, formative, and summative. So diagnostic is kind of like a diagnosis if you're going to a doctor or something, right? Like a diagnostic assessment is something that happens before the students really begin learning. So something about what they already know about your topic. And usually this would be ungraded. So just, you know, like a pre-course quiz, like what do you remember from the previous class that, you know, is a prerequisite for this course? Or, you know, if you've done a reading, or rather, sorry, before you do a reading, what do you know about this topic? So those can be, again, usually ungraded, really informal, but I think it's really good to get students thinking about what do they already know, or what preconceived ideas might they have about this subject, and then they can see later, you know, if they go back and look at what they used to think and now see what they now know. It's kind of neat. So diagnostic is sort of before the students begin learning. Formative assessment is kind of an ongoing process. So formative assessment is maybe a bit of both, student learning and assessment of seeing what they know. And formative assessment could be graded or ungraded. It could happen at any time during the term, and I've got lots of ideas for really great formative assessments. And then finally, we have summative assessments, which again, usually, typically in a normal situation, that might be a closed book, end of term, final exam type situation. So the primary goal of a summative assessment is to see what the students have learned. It's not about being a learning tool itself, it's just about seeing what they have learned. Usually again at the end of term and usually graded. So I just wanted to draw that distinction between these three types of assessments. They're all valuable. And I think it's really important that if you do have all three types of assessments, they should build on each other. So there shouldn't be, you know, a formative assessment that's do this one thing, and then a summative assessment that's completely different, that's, you know, not at all related to that formative assessment. So part of the point of the formative assessment is to teach the students what they need to know to succeed at the summative assessment. And similarly, part of the diagnostic assessment is to teach the students what they're missing, what they don't yet know that they will learn during the course. So I think it's important that all these three types of assessments should build on each other. Sometimes the word that's used is scaffolding. If you imagine like building a building, you're going to build the first floor, and then some scaffolding will go up to build higher and higher and higher. So a scaffolding of assessment is kind of knowledge building on top of itself. Next, second little mini point about assessment. If you were at my seminar in November, you've heard me talk about this maybe too much. You can tune out for a little bit if you want to. But this is the famous Bloom's taxonomy of learning. And I think I will take the time to just talk through this little picture a little bit. We can think about different levels at which a student knows something. So the very base level there in purple at the bottom is you have to remember stuff. So, you know, if you're an interest theory course, you have to remember that the present value is 1 plus I to the power of negative t, if t is the time of the payment. You know, if you're doing probability, and you have to remember that the definition of independence is the probability of AB is equal to the probability of A times the probability of B. So there's just stuff you need to know at the very basic level. And questions that test remembering are things like, you know, list or define or memorize or identify or name these things. So just the very basic remembering or accessing knowledge from their brain. Memorizing is what it used to be called. The next level above that is a little bit more involved. So that's understanding. So making sense out of that information. So that might be, you know, like, here are two random variables. Can you prove that they're independent? Or here's an interest theory situation. We don't know how long this is, but we know what the present value is. Can you find the length of time it would take to grow to that amount? So something that requires the students to actually interpret the information in some way, or do something with it other than just remember it. Then we have applying, which is kind of similar maybe, but that's using that information that they have, that they remember and they do understand, in a new but similar situation to what they've seen before. So if you've done examples in class and you're asking them to do another thing very similarly on an assignment, that's maybe multiple steps. They have to remember and understand several different techniques and apply them in this new situation, then that might be an applying question. So all three of those levels I sort of consider like base level Bloom's taxonomy. Above that, there's sort of more depth of knowledge or more sophisticated knowledge of a particular topic. So that could be, in no particular order, creating, evaluating, and analyzing. So creating would be making something new. So in design an insurance policy to cover this particular eventuality. So, you know, what might it cover? What conditions might there be? Or thinking about maybe in a statistical modeling class, like what explanatory variables might you want if you were designing an experiment to test something. So using the information that they know and understand to actually create something new. Evaluating is really important as well. So critically evaluate and make judgments on other materials. So if you give someone a balance sheet calculation and have them like actually evaluate whether it looks like it's been done correctly. If you give them an experimental design, they could critically examine, does this actually, do you think this is actually going to work? So looking at, do the assumptions for a given model actually hold in real life in a particular situation? And a lot of times in probability, we use the Poisson process to model things. And in practice, the conditions might not hold, right? Independence, maybe not, depending on what the situation is. So having students actually think in real life, would these assumptions hold for this situation is a really great way to test the depth of their understanding. And then finally, analyzing. Again, it's kind of similar to applying, but just again, at a little bit more high level. So examining and comparing and contrasting two different methods for something and comparing them to each other, noticing differences and similarities, or applying sort of multi-step processes to new situations that they have never seen before. So that's a sort of quick summary of Bloom's. And again, I think it's important to test students at all the levels. You can't only test the high level. They do need to remember stuff. They do need to understand stuff. So that those base levels do need to be tested. But I think you can really get a better sense of how deep students' knowledge goes. And you can really push them to understand the material more deeply by asking occasionally some of these creating, evaluating, and analyzing questions. And it's important to ask those types of questions, not just on the summative assessment, but throughout the term. So there should be, if you're going to ask them to evaluate, create, or analyze something on the final exam, they better have had practice doing that and feedback doing that on any formative assessments and maybe even on any diagnostic assessment. So giving them sort of thought questions like, what do you think about this? It's okay if you don't know yet, we'll learn about it. And then throughout the term, they get to build these skills. So it shouldn't be a surprise when they're asked to create, evaluate, or analyze something. It should be something that's built up those skills throughout the term. All right, finally, I wanted to chat a little bit about why students might cheat in a course. And this, again, was a major concern for all professors all over the world. Everyone is worried about this. So I want to share some of the things that have been found. And also, I do want to talk to you about what I did in my large undergraduate course in the winter term and the results that I got from it. So students don't necessarily cheat more in online courses. And that might be surprising. But remember, there have been online courses for a long time. Like they are not new. There have been online courses for a while. And before that, even there were correspondence courses where you would literally get in the mail via VHS tape and put it into your VCR and then like watch a video or listen to something on a CD. So there have been courses that are taught remotely for a long time. And a lot of research over the years has suggested that the rates of cheating in online versus in-person courses are very similar. There's always going to be some, you're never going to get rid of it all, but the rates are fairly low and fairly consistent between online and in-person courses. What does make people cheat more is stress and pressure and, all of these things. And unfortunately, right now is a time of very high stress. So moving online and being stressed at the same time is naturally going to cause students to feel like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. They're going to maybe cheat more. So if you do see more cheating, it's not necessarily because of the move to online, it's because the students are under a lot of stress. So again, lots of different reasons why students might cheat in the first place in any kind of course, online or not, including stress and pressure. Maybe not seeing the value in the assessments, thinking it's just some hoop to jump through and just they want to get it over with. Especially students will cheat if they don't think they can succeed without it. So if they think that there's the only way for them to pass this is to cheat, that's going to make them more likely to do it. Assessments that are higher stakes are going to be more likely to have cheating on them. So if it's worth 80% of their final grade, it's going to be more likely to have cheating than something that's worth less. Obviously, just having the opportunity there, there's a possibility that people will cheat more if there is an opportunity. And finally, if they don't know what the rules are, if it's unclear what the norms are, where the line is, what the boundaries are, then students are more likely to cheat. So again, none of these are unique to online courses. They all would apply in any course. But in particular, I want to talk about how we can address these so that we don't see additional cheating above what we might normally see. So in terms of stress, it's really important to make sure that students are given the resources that they need to succeed. That kind of goes with the third point here too, just giving them resources, giving them enough support and guidance and resources to do well on the assessments, and time to do well on these assessments without adding undue stress. In terms of not seeing the value, making sure that you give assessments that are meaningful. And actually, I think it's really important to explain to your students why you're using certain types of assessments. If it's something that's new, if it's something that's unusual, say why you think this is important and why you're going to assess them in this way. I think it's really important for you to have this particular skill, and so I'm going to test you on this. Or I think, when you go out into the workplace, you are going to need to know how to do this. And so I'm going to assess you on that so that you build up that skill. So telling students why you chose those particular types of assessments can go a long way to making them see the value in them. I mentioned this before, sort of making the summative assessments similar to the formative assessments. So again, not exactly the same, you don't want to give it away, but something that they're not completely thrown off by. It's not completely blindsided by, oh my gosh, they're asking me to do this. I have no tools to do this. They need to be built up to those tasks that you want them to be able to do, and have a reasonable level of difficulty. So have some questions on the final exam that are easy, like straight up easy. It's okay to have some questions that are easy, as long as there are also some parts that are maybe a little bit more challenging, and some maybe a few parts that are quite challenging to sort of differentiate. So if a student looks at an assessment and every single question, part A, is something they can't even start, of course they're going to be tempted to cheat because they don't see any other way to succeed. So if you give questions that build up in difficulty and are similar to what they've seen before, they'll be more likely to give it an honest try. To get away from the high stakes assessments, one way, of course, is to have more frequent, smaller assessments. That's generally good advice, not just for online, but in any course. So having more frequent, smaller tasks for them to do also helps them keep up with the material. So there's an added benefit of that, right? If all you have is a midterm test and a final exam, you know what's going to happen. Everyone's going to try and cram the first few weeks of material right before the midterm and the last bunch of weeks right before the final. And that's not a great way for students to learn. And it also causes more stress, which also leads to increased cheating. So if you have more frequent, smaller, less weighted assessments, then students are making sure that they're keeping up with the material. They're going to be less stressed about each one of them because each one of them is quite small. You could even have, say, if you have 5 tests, you drop the lowest one or something, and they're much smaller, like they're not as big. So it's not like it's more work to create them. You just have fewer questions on each one. The same total number of questions you might have on a midterm and a final, you can spread out over 5 tests and then drop the lowest one out of them. So lots of different ways that you can reduce the stakes and reduce the stress. In terms of removing the temptation, again, that kind of comes back to everything I've said before. Giving students the tools that they need to succeed, allowing them to ask you questions if they're lost, removes the temptation to cheat. And noticing, telling them that this is the case, that this is what you're doing and why. Lastly, again, students will be more likely to cheat when they don't know where the line is between cheating and not cheating. So I think it is really important to take the time to talk to your class about the importance of being honest with their assessments. One thing that you can refer to actually in the Society of Actuaries in the US and also the Canadian Institute of Actuaries in Canada, there's a sort of code of professional conduct that actuaries need to follow. And so I'm sure there's one similar one for every actuarial organization in the world. So telling people about that, showing them this, that being an actuary involves having a certain amount of professional integrity and personal integrity, that's going to be something that's important for their whole career, not just for their academic career. So instilling those values early and pointing out that this is not, just for now. This is, integrity is important in the business world as well. And also just reminding them of what the rules are from your perspective for each assessment that you do. So it is a good idea, I think, to have some assessments where collaboration with other students is not just allowed, but encouraged. So having some assessments where they're supposed to discuss with other people and they're supposed to talk their ideas off each other and take, from other sources. And then also have some assessments that are like, okay, now this has to be your own work. So making it clear what the rules are for different assessments each time and reminding them every time, even if you think you've already said it, remind them again. That's much more likely for students to then follow those rules if they understand the importance of integrity and they have some opportunities to collaborate and some where they know this is just their own. So I think now would be another good time to pause for questions. I saw a bunch of things in the chat, so I'm going to start there and see where we get. Okay. How can you manage people who don't really watch your presentation? At least you don't know for sure which one who pay attention and which one are not. Yeah, that's a really good point. So that can be, ooh, my chair just tried to kick me out of it. That can be tough because you put all this effort into creating these great videos or whatever, great reading material, and then you don't know who's actually watching it. So it depends on your learning management system. Sometimes you might be able to tell who has clicked on a certain file or who has opened a certain file. You can't necessarily tell if they've watched it all the way through, but at least you can see if they started it. So that might be a nice thing to look at. And then if someone has literally not opened any of your videos, 3 weeks into the term, you could send an email and just be like, hey, I noticed you haven't been seeing the videos, wanted to make sure you're okay. Is there any problem accessing them? Is your internet not working at home? You can just sort of reach out with compassion and say, is there anything I can do to make this material more accessible to you? But you're right, you don't necessarily know who's going to be watching it and who's not. We see the same problem in regular classes too. There's sometimes people just miss a class and you don't know, especially if it's a big class. So I think it is a concern the same way it is a concern in an in-class situation. But in the end, your students have the responsibility to for their own learning. That's where I think those sort of like weekly reminders of like, by this point, you should have done this and this and this, so they aren't completely lost. And then having assessments frequently is another good way to ensure that people will at least hopefully try to keep up with the material. So if they, missed 1 or 2 of your videos and then they're like, oh crap, I have a test coming up, they might watch a little bit of them in that way. So there's no way to force someone to watch every single video, but especially if you make your assessments very linked to what you say in the videos, then that will give people incentive to watch them. So for example, if you had kind of, I'm going to talk about this later, but like a frequent quiz that's low stakes but worth a little bit, and then in the quiz you can say, here's a question. If you don't know what to do, go to this video and watch this at this minute. So you can actually refer people back to the material that you want them to learn in the assessments that you're giving them. So that can be a really nice way to sort of get people to focus on the stuff that you want them to see. All right. Oh, sorry. There's just, what kind of assessments that we can give to students during class while learning? Yeah, because normally assessment will be given after class. So that's a really good point as well. It depends if you're using synchronous or asynchronous. If you're using synchronous, so the students are there and you're there at the same time and you're on maybe a video call or something, there's a lot of systems like Zoom has a polling feature built in, so you can ask students a question and then they can respond, and then you can see who said what, kind of like, true or false, are these variables independent, or I don't know. So that you could do sort of during class. If you're doing asynchronous, you can have videos where at a certain point you could say, hey, I'm going to ask you a question now. I want you to pause the video and think about it. So you can't verify that they've actually done it, but that's like, again, that's kind of like a formative or maybe more like a diagnostic type of assessment. So, at the very beginning of class, you can say, here's what we're going to be thinking about today. Here's a situation. How do you think this should go? Or what do we need to know to solve this? And then they watch the video or listen to it. And then at the end, you could say, okay, now let's go back to that question from the beginning of class. What would you say now that we've learned this? So that's kind of one way that you can insert assessment, but it's kind of more like self-assessment into your classes while the learning is happening. Should all levels of learning exist in one course, say probability theory, or some courses only have the basic level, while some courses have the advanced? That's a good point as well. I think to a certain extent, yes, like the lower level the course, the more basic the levels of learning it's going to be focused on. You know, if you're taking like a very first ever probability course, you're going to have more basic level stuff and less higher level compared to, you know, like a measure theory, probability theory, super heavy grad level course. But I really do think that in every course, even the most basic, there is room for those high levels. I think in even the most basic course, even just like calculus or algebra, if you teach that, you can have those types of questions that test their understanding at a deeper level. And so again, I teach probability a lot, so I have lots of examples for that. But I really love the idea of, you know, do you think these assumptions that are required for this model, say the binomial random variable, would hold in real life? That's a pretty high level question, because let's multiple at once, because they have to remember what are the conditions for a binomial random variable. Okay, maybe they can open their book and look those up, but then they have to think, what would those actually mean in the context of this problem that you've given them? And that is something that's really hard to fake, I guess. They have to think about it. And even again, in a very basic probability theory course, there's room for that. So I think having a few questions on those high levels is really important. Of course, the higher level that the course is, the more advanced material, there's more opportunities for those higher level questions, but I think you can have them even in introductory courses. Number 4, at the online situation, how to ensure the honesty of students that they are doing their own work and not cheating. So yeah, that's a great question as well. There's no perfect answer. At a certain point, you have to just hope that they're doing what they say they're doing. I think if you take some of this advice that's on the slide that's currently up now, so explain the importance of integrity, use a variety of lower stakes assessments so that the temptation for cheating is removed, and provide them with enough resources, and the assessments are sort of achievable by the students, that's going to reduce the temptation to cheat by a lot. I have some ideas for how to sort of catch people who are cheating, but I don't think that should be the focus of your time and energy. I think your time and energy is limited, and it should be more focused on not chasing down cheaters and trying to catch them, but in creating the conditions where cheating is minimized because students are motivated to do their own work. So I have a couple more ideas for that later, but I'm gonna leave that for now. Okay. If you find that the students' marks are very low, what do you do in the final? Have you had an experience making an adjustment to make? Yeah. So it's been a long time since I've had to do that. I guess the more I teach, the more good I get at sort of pitching my tests at the right level. But that's tough. So I think my advice for that is making sure that all of your assessments, in particular the ones that are heavily weighted, have a good amount of questions that are fairly basic. So, you know, if someone has done most of the work, watched most of the videos, tried to keep up with the material, and has like a reasonably good understanding of the material, they should be able to get 50% on the course. So you shouldn't have every question be hard, because if you do, then someone who knows half of the material will get 0. So, you know, half the questions should be fairly basic, at a basic level. And then there should be some that are a more difficult level, and then a few that are really quite challenging to sort of help give those really strong students a challenge and see how far they can stretch their knowledge. So part of it comes to the design of your assessment. Sometimes, even when you think you have a really nicely balanced assessment, people just do poorly on it. And that happens, it does happen. So there's a few different ways you could address that. One, obviously, you could just like shift the marks for that particular assessment. that doesn't necessarily, I mean, that's fine. That's a fine thing to do. I'm not saying it's good or bad. That's a simple thing to do. Just say like, okay, you know, this assessment was out of 60. Most people did pretty badly. In fact, the highest mark was 50 out of 60. So now let's just take your grade out of 50 instead of out of 60. So that kind of shifts everybody up. That's a simple, easy thing to do. One other thing you could do is do maybe a 2-stage test. So if it was kind of universal, like everyone did poorly on it, you can say, okay, that didn't go great. How about you take another 2 days and you could resubmit up to 2 questions. And then, you know, or maybe even just 1 question. The question you think you did the worst on, you can resubmit it. So that has the advantage of giving students another shot at kind of redeeming themselves from this. And they're going to learn a lot from the second time they do the test, because they're going to go back, they're going to study, they're going to figure out what they did wrong, and they're going to resubmit. So one of my coworkers actually did that. He did that for a fairly large class, had everybody do the test, and then over the weekend, he graded them with the teaching assistants that he had, and then he gave them the test back on Monday and said, okay, you can have 2 more days if you want to resubmit. And students got together, and you know, it was completely open book at that point. It was allowed to be. So they went through and found what they had done wrong, and they fixed it, and they gave their second one. And then the mark that they were given on the test was, I think he did the average of the first and the second attempt, or maybe it was like slightly higher weighted on their first attempt and lower weighted on their second attempt. There's different ways you could do it. So the disadvantage with that, of course, is it's more work to mark. Although marking papers that are mostly right is really fast. If it's mostly correct, it's really, really easy to mark. So that's a way to sort of make students accountable to that material and also raise their grades. So it's like if they didn't get something, they can't be just like, ah, never mind, I never need to learn that again. They have to face it. They have to look at it again and figure out what they went wrong and improve it. And then it gives them that sort of chance of redemption. So if you have a small enough class or resources that makes that possible, then that's a really great way to deal with it. Rather than just adjusting everybody's marks up, you make them redo it with open book completely, and you know, do whatever, talk to other people, whatever, do whatever you want, resubmit maybe a subset of the questions, and then let them get the benefit of that slightly higher grade. Again, it doesn't replace their original attempt, but maybe take the average. So hopefully that's an idea that you can maybe use. Oh, okay, on your slide about Bloom's taxonomy, why do you put creating, evaluating, and analyzing in one level? Thank you for asking that. So you may have seen Bloom's taxonomy like a triangle like this, where the bottom is remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating, like in a very strict hierarchy. The reason why I like this other one, where the top 3 are all at one level, is because I don't think that creating is necessarily always higher than evaluating. And I don't think that evaluating is always necessarily higher than analyzing. I think that all 3 of those ideas are what I consider sort of higher level questions. So I don't like putting those in a strict hierarchy with each other. So thank you for asking that, because the original Bloom's taxonomy does have it like a pyramid. So creating is at the top, followed by evaluating, followed by analyzing, from the top down. And you can think about it that way, but I think that you don't need to be able to evaluate to create. It's helpful, but those 2 things are both equally high level in my mind. So that's why I choose that picture instead of the traditional triangle one. Okay. 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay. I'm just mindful of the time. I think I am going to go on to my activities, and then I'll come back and address all of these last few questions plus any that come in between. I just want to make sure I get through the stuff that I wanted to say. These are all great questions. I just think I want to keep going for now, and then I will come back at the end, if that's okay. All right. Oh, I said I was gonna, right. I'm gonna do number 10, because I have a great answer for that relates to this very slide, and then I'll come back to the other ones later. So I'm going to close the chat, but I am going to address number 10, which was, can I give the example that I mentioned about preventing cheating at UW? So there's the course that I was teaching was an introductory probability course, about 500 students in the class. And the course was started in the January, so it was in class. Everyone was coming 3 times a week to class, plus we had a tutorial almost every other week, some kind of small assessment, something to do every other week. And then with 3 weeks to go at the end of term, it was turned into online only. So we had a few videos to sort of cover the last few weeks of course material. And we had still 3 assessments left that we were supposed to have. We were supposed to have a tutorial assignment, which is where the students come into class. It's kind of like an open book mini test, I guess, open book quiz. So they come into class, they can have their notes, they can talk to their friends, and the TAs and instructors are wandering around trying to help them with their answers. And most people end up getting perfect on it. So it's just kind of like a mini, just a checkpoint that they're doing stuff. We were supposed to have a test, so just on one little section of the material, and we're supposed to have a comprehensive final exam that covers like the entire course. So all 3 of those had to change. For the tutorial assignment, we just turned it into a regular assignment. Just open book, can discuss with anyone they like, just free to discuss on the discussion board. The marks on that were basically identical to the marks on the usual tutorial assignments because the conditions were the same. They were allowed to use their notes, they were allowed and encouraged to talk to other people. For the test, we did it time limited. And so it was, normally they would have had 1 hour. We gave them, I think, 1.5 hours just for technical issues. And they were told it's open book, but they're only to use their own knowledge. So they can look at anything on the course website or the discussion board up to that point, but they can't talk to other people. And we had them, the last question was just them saying, I confirm that I have not talked to anybody else about this, and they signed their name. So it was, again, relatively limited time, relatively similar questions to what they had been asked on previous tests, similar to the course notes. It was open book, and the grades on that were slightly higher than the other tests had been, but not a lot. For the final exam, we had, this was like a major concern because the final exam was worth a pretty significant part of the course grade. And it was now not worth as much because we had to readjust our marking schemes. But what we did for this one was we made took the final exam we were normally going to give, which had a combination of true, false, multiple choice, fill in the blank, and long answer questions. And we just made very slight tweaks to some of those questions. So if it was like a true false question, we would add like not instead of, just negate the question. Or if it was a fill in the blank, we would just, what distribution is this? Give a scenario and then just change what it's asking for. So it's like you're rolling a die 10 times. What's the probability you get 3 5s or whatever? Like we just changed a couple of little details. So, and then for the long answer questions, same kind of thing. We just change a couple of the numbers for them. And then we had our learning management system randomize the questions. So each student got an exam that was the same difficulty as everybody else, but no 2 students had the exact same exam. In fact, I put on the exam a question, which was basically, here's how many questions there are, and here's how many are being chosen. How many different versions of the exam could there be? And the answer was something like in 10 to the power of 34. Like it was just crazy because of so many little tiny changes. And they knew that nobody was getting the same questions as them. Nobody, as far as I know, collaborated with each other. Same thing, we also said you're allowed to use anything on the course website, including the course notes and anything on the discussion board. And you're allowed to ask questions of the instructor. So privately, just the same as, if you were in a room in an exam and a student put up their hand and asked a question to clarify, what does this mean? So we allowed students to ask questions over the 10-day period that the exam was available. And there was no time limit for the exam. They could open it one day, do a few questions, leave it, come back, do a few more, no time limit at all. The grades on the final exam, when I did an analysis of those versus all of the proctored assessments, so all of the assessments we had where it was closed book, individual work only, guaranteed. So the first and second midterm and the first and second tests. So we'd had 4 closed book, individual work only proctored assessments already. And comparing the final exam to those 4, there was no difference in the grades, statistically different. it was 0.8% higher, which is, you know, with that many students, that's pretty much insignificant. So I don't know necessarily what it was that ended us having so little evidence of cheating. Probably a combination of all of those things. So having it be open book, allowing students, specifically allowing them to access the course notes, having them know that nobody's getting the same questions as them. So there's no point, you know, getting together in a room and trying it at the same time. Having them able to ask questions over the period of time was probably really helpful, because if someone's stuck on a question, they don't know how to start, they're going to feel like the only thing they can do is type it into Google or something. Whereas if they can ask, oh, hey, sorry, what are you asking me to do here, and get a response, then they're way more likely to stick with it and try their best work. So again, I don't know for sure that nobody cheated. I will never know. But in terms of the results, they were statistically insignificantly different from all of the assessments that we were sure were students' own work. So that's what the story that I wanted to share. Okay, everyone cool if I keep moving on? I've got another half hour to do the last bit. So, oops, I was on the wrong, there we go. So I want to start my sort of assessment list with some principles that I think are really important for any assessment, not just in an online course, but in particular for an online course. And these, weirdly enough, all start with A. So I think that assessments are really important to be authentic, meaning that it's something that's actually meaningful for the students to do. So it's not just busy work, getting them to, you know, answer 10 questions that are all basically the same thing, and just only, you know, something that they only need to know to pass this one assessment and will never use again. So something that's actually meaningful, useful in their later career, something that they can see the value of. I think that's really important to have assessments, in at least some in your course, that are authentic in some way. You want your assessments to be aligned with your learning outcomes. So essentially, you can think about at the beginning of the course, what do you want your students to know? And whatever you want them to know, that's what you should test them on. Don't test them on, you know, only calculations, if what one thing you want them to know is to be able to explain statistical concepts in plain language. If that's a learning goal you have for them, you should be assessing them on that skill. Your assessment should be achievable. So a reasonable level of difficulty. Here's a rough guideline. Again, this isn't set in stone, but maybe 60-ish%, 50 or 60%, fairly basic questions. That's, you know, something that someone who's watched the videos and paid attention should be able to get without too much trouble. 30%, a little bit harder questions, and maybe 10% that are very challenging for those really top students. So again, that's a rough guideline. You don't have to stick with it exactly, but that kind of scaffolding of difficulty, so that nobody is looking at the paper and has no idea how to start any question, because that's just not fair. And finally, associated with your course. So this is the side benefit of this, I guess, is that it reduces cheating, but the idea of using material specifically from your lecture material. So not just, you know, the same questions they would get from any other textbook. If you used a particular example in class, you can refer to that on an assessment. If there was an interesting discussion on the discussion board in your course, you can refer to that. If something interesting is happening in your city or in the local news, then you can use that. So things that have to do, or like your own university, things that bring students into the material and relate it to their lives and their experience in this course. It's going to make the material feel much more present and relevant in their to the students. And also, again, side benefit, it's harder to cheat on those things if it's referring to specifically stuff that you have talked about in your course. So those are, again, the 4 A's. I guess not every assessment can be all of these things all of the time, but those are just some good principles for having assessments that are authentic, aligned with your learning outcomes, achievable, and associated with your course. So the assessment activities that I want to talk about, there are 8 of them. I'm going to just have one slide on each of them. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes on each one. And these are roughly actually in order of when they might occur in the flow of diagnostic, formative, summative. So Yeah. So, you know, a self-assessment and practice question discussion board posting is kind of more diagnostic. Peer learning, quizzes, assignments, reflective writing is a bit more formative. Open book tests and oral exams are maybe a bit more summative. But all of them sort of cross all of the categories. So here we go. For self-assessment or practice questions, these are questions that the students can try and get instant feedback. And they're maybe closed-ended, so multiple choice or true-false type things. And those could be integrated into the lectures or not. It's up to you. So if you want to think about integrating them into the lectures, that could be, if it's an asynchronous thing, it could just be a thought question where you say, okay, before we start this example, what do you think you know, the impact will be on this present value if the interest rate is higher? Will this present value be higher or lower? Pause now and think about it. Who knows if the student will actually pause or not? Hopefully some of them will, you know, some of them will, some of them won't. They'll think about it, they'll formulate an answer in their head, and then they unpause and you give them the answer. So they get instant feedback on whether they're right or wrong. You can also have this be, you know, literal quiz on a learning management system where they click a button and then say submit, and then it tells them that they were right or wrong. That's more complicated than it needs to be. But this can be, again, something that's incorporated into your lectures or outside of it. But the key is that they get to test the material, test themselves basically on the material in a low stakes, or in this case, no stakes way. There's nothing bad happens to them if they get it wrong. So it's a really safe environment to practice thinking about the material. They're going to be ungraded for that reason, because you don't know or care necessarily if they did all of them. It's just giving them an opportunity to think about, what do I know? Am I right? They find out right away, and then they can move on. But ideally, there's some similarities between the questions that you're going to ask on later graded assessments. This is that idea of scaffolding, so that your diagnostic questions are leading them into doing well on those formative assessments, which is leading them to do well on the summative assessment. One way to make this easy is to use existing resources. So goal is guided online actuarial learning, and I have a link that I'm going to give to Pak-San to give to all of you, that you can maybe get a look at that. That has lots and lots of multiple choice questions on actuarial exam topics. So that includes probability, interest theory, life contingencies, and some other more advanced stuff as well. Often textbooks might have online resources. You can adapt the existing questions you already have and just get them, turn them into practice questions. So don't reinvent the wheel here. Just sort of think about questions you normally get people to think about and include them in one way or another. If you have large classes, there's no more work because everything's auto-graded. It's not like it takes time to grade each person. So it's either auto-graded and the feedback is given to them, or it's incorporated into a video where you say it once and then people make the choice to do it or not. So that's the idea of self-assessment questions. I think it's really important to give students the chance to think about their own knowledge in that way. The second possible assessment technique is discussion board posting. And that seems like it wouldn't necessarily be an assessment technique, but it can be. So depending on the size of your course, you could require a certain number of posts and replies to various topics. So that could be, say, 5% of the student's grade is for their participation in the discussion board. The nice thing about that is that the discussion can happen asynchronously, right? Someone can post a question and then several hours or a few days later, someone else can post a reply. So it doesn't need to be synchronous. It's not going to punish students who aren't able to be there at the same time. Or you could make it for bonus marks. So you could say, you know, up to 1% bonus or however much for your participation in the discussion boards. That's sometimes maybe a little bit nicer, and it doesn't take much bonus for people to really, really go and do some good stuff, because there can be a lot of value in discussions between students on the board. So you could have the students themselves post the topics, or you could post prompts. So you could say, again, I always come back to probability for my examples, but you could say, here is, or give me an example of a binomial random variable, and then students, and explain why you think the conditions are satisfied. And then students could reply with their ideas. And then other students could like upvote or downvote, and then you could get the best binomial result or something. That's just a silly little idea. You could even do something like maybe in the life contingencies course of like, what impacts do you think COVID-19 is going to have on the insurance industry? And then that's a way more open-ended question, right? People can talk about all sorts of different things. You know, will it affect health? Of course. Will it also affect asset values? Probably. Will it affect like car accidents? There's fewer car accidents now because people aren't driving as much. So there's all these different ways that the students could take the discussion. You might be surprised what they come up with. If you are going to evaluate their participation on the discussion board, it's good to have a rubric. So that's just sort of like, you know, did they post 0 times, 1 time, or 2 or more times in the week? Were their contributions basically useless, somewhat useful, or really, really insightful? Just a quick scale to rank or to rate people's participation if you wanted to actually use it for grades. One really nice thing about that is that based on the discussion that occurs, you can take ideas from that and use them in assignment prompts later or for test questions. So it's a really great, it's a rich source of material that's student generated that you can then incorporate into the class in other ways. And if you do have extremely large classes, one thing that might help is actually dividing the class into smaller discussion groups. If you have, you know, 200 people on a discussion board, people might be really shy about posting, even though nobody's actually there in person. So you could divide the class into smaller discussion groups so they're more accountable to each other. The downside with that, though, is that they, you know, something really cool is happening in one board, another set of students might miss that. So there's upsides and downsides for doing that. All right, I forgot to mention that every slide that I have here, I have a little tip for large classes or how this might apply in large classes. So I'm going to be saying that every time. Alrighty, third item is the idea of peer learning. So peer learning just means students learning from each other, and that can happen in lots of different ways. Could be formal or informal, but in particular here, I'm thinking about the idea of peer review or collaboration. So having students look at other students' work and evaluating it. So that's that like really high level of Bloom's, of like looking at someone else's contribution and saying, okay, this is good in this way and bad in this way, and giving meaningful feedback. So that's helpful both for the person that's getting evaluated because they get cool feedback, and it's helpful for the person doing the feedback because they have to look at it, you know, with a bit more of a nuanced view. So that's a really nice way to incorporate it. You could, if you wanted, make that more formal and have the students actually grade each other. And there are lots of technologies out there for making that easier. One is peergrade.io or Compare, which has basically, it's a comparison between a pair of students. That's Compare, pretty silly. So that there's other ones as well. The Critic is another one. Peer Scholar is another one. There's a bunch. I'll make a list and I'll send it to Pak-Ik-san and he can send it to you. So these are sort of more formal. So the student would actually get a grade from another student. I'm not sure how I feel about that. Like it scales nicely, but there might be some, you know, someone's, and it's anonymous too. So the student doesn't know whose submission they're grading. It's anonymized. But you might be uncomfortable with that as an instructor, and that's okay. The most important point of this is not the grade. It's the looking at each other's contributions and giving feedback and receiving feedback. So you can do that whether or not you actually use the grading aspect of it. The thing that you could get them to evaluate from each other could be anything. But one thing I really like to do is to have the students create something that will teach others. So you could have them create a question on a certain set of material. So you could say, you know, based on the first 3 weeks of the material we've covered, create one question on this material with a solution. And then you could have students peer review them. Or even cooler, actually, you could have students just create the question and then have another student solve it and also evaluate the question. So that's kind of a cool way of doing things. You could also have students make videos explaining course concepts. That's, again, very nicely extends to online, so that works pretty well. I've done that in my courses before, but I've never had other students evaluate those videos. So I think I'm going to do that this term in the fall. So it's nice too, because then once they've done that, you have all these resources, you have all these cool little videos and questions that students have created, and that can inspire you, and you can use those for other purposes. You can use them as a practice question bank for students that you didn't even have to help create. You might just have to check them to make sure they're not wrong. For large classes, this is great because the more people you have that can grade each other. So, you know, if you have 100 students, that's 100 people that can give feedback to other people. So it scales really, really well. So I love this idea for any size of class, but it works really well for a large class too. Next, talking about quizzes. So MS, by MS I mean multiple select. So that's sort of questions that have multiple possible correct answers. And it's like, so select all of the following that are true. And then so there's like, rather than only one correct answer, there's multiple correct answers. Multiple choice, the way you normally think about it, and true false. So the idea with this is maybe having short, relatively short, so easy to prepare for you, and low stakes quizzes, maybe worth 1 or 2% each, maybe not even that much, relatively frequently throughout the term. So it could be every week, maybe every 2 weeks, that kind of thing. So the point of these is they kind of act as the tour guide for the course. So what should you know by this point? Reinforcing those key ideas. And then also you can include questions that kind of hint at later material. So they're relatively, you know, again, fairly basic, straightforward material. There can be a couple of challenging questions on there, or a couple of questions that lead them to what they will be talking about next time. So, you know, you could think about, okay, so interest theory, here's the formula for an annuity. And then what would happen if the annuity was an increasing amount each time? So before they've learned it, you could ask them what would happen to that present value and think about how they might then introduce that concept in the next class. So just kind of an idea of giving a preview of what's coming for the next week. If you wanted to, you could randomize the order of the options within each question, or the order of the questions, or the numbers within a question if you're worried about cheating. And I just want to emphasize that you don't need a lot of questions, like you don't need a large question bank to make this effective. Like if you have 10 questions, if you just make 2 versions of each, so flip the true false to be a yes or a no, like a not or a take out the not, you know, switch up the order of the multiple choice, or change a number, or change a couple of little tiny details. If you do that, 2 versions of 10 questions, that's 1,024 tests that you just created. So nobody has more than 1,024 students in your class, I guarantee. I mean, maybe, I hope not. That's a really big class. So yeah, you don't need a lot of tweaks to questions to have a big question bank. It's, again, it's fine if some people have some of the same questions, but having slight changes, if that makes you feel better about people comparing answers, then that's a great way to do it. But again, if they're low stakes and relatively basic material, most of the time, probably people are just going to be like, well, okay, I'll give this a try. I'll do what I can. If I get something wrong, cool. No big deal. It's nice to have multimodal quizzes. By that, I mean not just all multiple choice. So maybe have some true false, some multiple choice, some multiple select, whatever. And ideally, maybe 1 or 2 short answer questions where they just fill in an answer. So in probability, you know, which distribution might we use to model this phenomenon? And they just fill in the answer. So that's, you know, it's a little bit better to just have more than one type of question, just in terms of the way that people's brains work. And for large classes, this is wonderful because they can be auto-graded. You can set them up, especially if you're not using any short answer. You can have them be auto-graded, and then you don't have to touch them. So students will do the quiz, and then once the deadline has happened, you'll release the grades. There's no work at all in terms of actually grading it. And that's really, really nice. That scales well as well. Okay, I'm done 4 of my 8, and I have 13 minutes left. I think I'm ever so slightly behind pace, but I'm going to try and pick it up. So number 5, written assignments. These can work very similarly to how they would work in any on-campus course. It's really nice if you can allow some choice of questions so that the students can work on the stuff that they find most compelling. So I really love to do this in my sort of more upper year courses. I'll have students read papers that have been published relatively recently and pick one of them and summarize. So I'll give them 3 different choices and on 3 different topics. So, you know, like a pension plan has gone bankrupt and here's a news article about it. Or here's an article on firearm usage and how that should affect insurance rates, or here's, you know, whatever, like things that are being researched. And then students can pick the one that's most interesting to them and provide a quick summary. So that kind of allows the students to tailor the material to their own interests. Again, that works well in an upper year class when students maybe have an idea where they want to go in their career, and then they can do something useful to their career. But even at lower levels, you know, you can have students research different insurance policies. So you can give them links to insurance documents and then have them summarize the key features of an insurance policy. And you can let them pick which type of policy they can look at. So they can, again, tailor the material to their own interests. You definitely want to include, this is a great way to include sort of localized info. So referring to something specific from what you talked about in your lecture material, something that happened on your discussion board. You can ask them to provide, you know, from a local newspaper, something, you know, a badly used statistic, or, you know, from an ad that they've seen. If they've seen an ad somewhere with a badly used statistic, it's really, really great to ask people to find that and call it out. So having people interact with the material in the course and apply it to their life locally, like in some way that's meaningful to them, is really helpful. As a bigger assignment, you could have maybe a multi-stage project, which, you know, might have a proposal, and then, you know, they have to get some data if they need it, and then a draft report and a presentation. That's obviously only going to work in a relatively small class, but that's another idea of this kind of scaffolding of assessment. So it's not just they do it once and then they're done, but they do something and then they revisit it and improve it over and over again until it's something really great. And if you're going to have a large class and you want written assignments, allowing students to work in pairs or groups and just share the mark, that cuts your marking in half if they can work in pairs. The issue with that, though, is that you don't necessarily know that they didn't just divide up the work, like, okay, you do question 1 and 2, I'll do question 3 and 4, we'll stick them together and hand it in. You can emphasize that even if they do that, they still are responsible for knowing the content of the other questions that they didn't work on, and it cuts your marking in half. So that's kind of nice. All right, reflective writing is my next idea. And the definition of reflective writing is just something where the students reflect or think about the goals that they had for the course and what they have learned. So this could be done in lots of different ways. I've used it in the past, both at the beginning of the course and at the end, sometimes throughout. So here are some things you could ask them to reflect on. You could ask students to think about what are the most important course concepts that they've learned in, you know, the last few weeks, and summarize them in plain language. You could ask them to describe a problem that they had trouble with earlier, but now they get, and what was that key that made them understand it. Or even you could ask them what's something that's still confusing that they still want to find out. What are their goals for learning in the rest of the course? You could even think about asking them like a more personal question, like, why do you want to study actuarial science? What was it that made you do that? And think about what are your career goals and that kind of thing. Or at the end of the course, you can ask them whether they think they achieved their goals for the course. So lots of different prompts, super easy to create these types of assignments, and marking them can be really validating. Like when you see people like actually have understood and struggled with material and now understand it better because of your work as an instructor, it's the best feeling in the whole world. Marking them is a little bit weird, right? Because it's kind of someone's just telling you their personal feelings. So usually I sort of, if they've made an honest effort to reflect and think about their own learning, 10 out of 10. So it doesn't have to be, you know, they don't have to have it be perfect in every way, but you can use a quick rubric to, I've got one, so I can share it, or for how to grade reflective writing. Just have they thought about how the course material applies to them? Have they thought about how their goals have changed, etc.? So it's relatively easy and really affirming to read these, and relatively quick to grade. Okay, almost done. Oral exams, if you know me, you know that I love these. And I've talked about them before in when I was there in November. But I think oral exams are a really great way to check the level of understanding. And this is one way you can be absolutely 100% sure that it is the student's own work, that because you're literally talking to them, to, you know, over the phone or over Zoom or whatever, but you're talking to them and you know that that's them. So you can ask all sorts of cool things in an oral exam. You could ask them to define topic in a lot of detail or as much as possible. Anything in any course. So, you could define random variable. You could define interest. What is interest? You could define whole life insurance. You could define stochastic process. You could define Poisson process. You could define universal life insurance. You could define regression. Anything you can think of, you can ask students for a full and fleshed out definition and see how deep their knowledge can go. You can ask them to evaluate advantages and disadvantages of something, compare two things, so compare two distributions, compare two investment strategies, compare two insurance products, whatever, or discuss an algorithm or process for something. Or another way actually is ask them to explain their solution to a problem. So one of my coworkers recently did this. He was teaching basically a proofs course, and he would sort of ask them to walk him through a proof that he gave them to do. So there's lots of different ways that you could use this. If you have a large class, again, this doesn't work great because you have to spend some individual time with individual students. But if you do have a large class, you can still use this effectively by just sampling. So you let the students know. So let's say you have 100 students and you have 3 tests. So you let the students know, I'm going to pick 25 students each time and ask them to explain to me their solution for a question that I will pick. So once they've handed in their tests, you can look at them, and if you have any concerns at all, or any, or you can really truly pick randomly, you can say, okay, I want to hear you explain question 5 to me. How did you get that answer? And then, and the next person, I want you to explain question 6. So it can be the same one, it can be different, whatever. And the students know that they have a chance that they will be asked. They won't all be asked, but they all know that they might be. So that can help making sure that they at least understand what they're doing because they know that they might have to explain it to you. So that's my suggestion if you want to use something like this in a class that's too big to survey everyone. Finally, this is the one I've talked about before, using open book tests. So best practices for this, you want to tell them exactly what resources are allowed. And again, the reason why I think open book tests are better than closed is because we can't possibly enforce closed book. Cannot be done. Nobody, any technology someone says they have to, make sure that they're closed book, it's easy to break. So allowing them to use some limited amount of stuff, they're going to use that, and they'll be less likely to go outside of those parameters if you express those boundaries clearly. So tell them exactly what they're allowed. Are they allowed the course notes? Are they allowed everything on the course website? Are they allowed the discussion forum posts that have already occurred, or are you going to lock that down? Are they allowed to search things? Are they allowed Microsoft Excel? Whatever, specify exactly what resources are allowed, and just remind them every time. Having a shorter time limit is not something that I would recommend. So a lot of instinct is, okay, I'll just make a really hard test, give them not a lot of time, and then they won't have time to cheat. The problem with that is it just adds more stress, which is probably actually going to make it more likely for students to cheat. So I would say give them a generous amount of time to do it, more than you think they will need, maybe 24 hours, maybe 48 hours. The shorter time limit just adds stress. It doesn't fix any kind of cheating. So have them have a lot of resources available and a reasonably long amount of time to do it in, that they can have a good chance of succeeding. I've mentioned this before, the idea of having a balance of straightforward, more challenging, and super challenging questions. And definitely make sure you include some questions at higher Bloom's levels. Those are trickier to cheat on to begin with. And also, again, you want to make sure that you're testing the student's knowledge at all of those levels. And this should be true not just of your final exam, but of any evaluations that you give. I think it's really important to allow students to ask questions for clarification, ideally privately, although there's something to be said for, if there's actually a mistake in the exam, the student asks, oh, in question 3, did you mean standard deviation instead of variance? You can say, yes, I did. Sorry about that, everyone, rather than having to tell each individual person. But definitely give them the chance to ask questions. If you just say, nope, no questions, I'm shutting down the discussion board, and they're stuck, what do you think they're going to do? Whereas if you let them work through and ask questions, even if maybe they seem silly, you can just give them some clarification and off they go. If you want, again, you could randomize the questions like I described. So having different numbers or contexts or order. And again, it doesn't take much. It doesn't take a lot of different versions to make a large number of different tests. And for large classes, I'd recommend maybe using a combination of auto-graded multiple choice or true false, and maybe some written answer. That can, again, just cut down on the amount of marking that you need to do. But still, it's nice to have at least some like full solution written answer questions on a summative test. So that is everything for me. Here is a quick summary of all of these things that I've talked about, what stage they might be useful at, material that it could be useful for, some resources. I will send you links to all of these things, and just a little bit of guidance on like how long it might take to prep and how long it might take to grade. Yeah, and then finally, I'm going to pause for questions right after this. Some key takeaways from today's session, just the idea of creating and sustaining connections between students and between you and the students through good levels of communication and being present, using a variety of assessments that are those 4 A's: authentic, aligned with your learning goals, achievable, and associated with your context. And definitely save yourself some time. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. Employ or adapt existing resources as much as possible, so that you don't get overwhelmed. There's so many things to think about. There's so many new tools out there. Just pick 1 or 2, you know, stick with what you have and do the best you can. And remember, we're all in this together. We're all learning together. And so I'm going to leave it there. I'll go over to some questions. And if there are any more, please feel free to type them in the chat. I've reached the end of my time, but I'll stay a little bit longer if you don't mind, and I'll answer a few questions. So thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to just go back to where I was in the chat. Hold on, can I make it bigger? I can't, haha, okay. Now it's nice and big. Okay, how to categorize student grades, because in online learning, there are differences in situations like real exams they can do by open source or maybe cheating. So I'm not sure what you mean by categorize. So just like, yeah, I think you shouldn't assume that students are using closed book. Like there's just no, they're not gonna. So I think if you design your assessments so that having the notes there is not gonna ruin the assessment, then that's ideal, right? So having, you know, some basic questions, but also some questions that extend the material beyond that. I think that might be helpful, because again, in the real world, if you're working as an actuary and you forget something, you can look it up, right? That's how the real world works. You have resources available to you. So in terms of that, like an open book assessment is more authentic than a closed book assessment, because again, in real life, you're going to be able to use resources to do stuff. So having part of the assessment be, can you use the resources you have effectively to answer these questions and then extend your knowledge to a higher level? I think that's better, honestly. I may never go back to closed book assessments after this. I don't know. I might just let people use open book forever. Number 8, there are synchronous and asynchronous learning. How to divide learning materials effectively. What are the aspects to consider? Okay, that's a really good question. I deliberately didn't talk much about that today, like I was focusing on the assessment side. And again, there's not like a perfect balance to have, but I think you should only do synchronous if there's added value in having people there at the same time. So if there's, you know, discussion that you're wanting students to have, bouncing ideas off each other. If there's brainstorming where you want students to like give you ideas and you write them down. If there's really, really complicated stuff that's very hard to explain in a video, where you really need to like draw it out or have students come to the realization themselves. So if there's lots of value in having people there at the same time, then I think synchronous is a good, it's good to use synchronous for those types of things. Otherwise, probably asynchronous is as good as synchronous. Like if all you're doing when you meet synchronously is you're talking to the camera and the students are listening, I don't think it needs to be synchronous. You could just do it asynchronously. But if there's interaction between you and the students, if they're asking questions like you folks are to me now, then there's value in that synchronicity. So that's what I would suggest. That's the kind of considerations. A balance is great, and make sure that you use the time that you have synchronously for the most high impact teaching practices. Oh, number 9, how can you detect the level of stress of your students in following your class during online learning and help them cope with the conditions? That is a fabulous question. I think it's so important to show compassion and empathy for your students, because they are under a lot of stress. This is not what they were expecting from their university experience. They might have family members who are ill. They might, not have seen their friends in months and months and months, and they might be really sad. So one thing that I was at another seminar earlier today, someone suggested having a check-in at the beginning of any synchronous class. So just have a poll, anonymous poll. How are you feeling today? 1 to 10. You don't have to say why, just give me a 1 to 10. How stressed are you? How are you feeling? 10 is I'm feeling fabulous. 1 is I am not doing well. And again, no pressure for students to have to answer, can be anonymous. And then just be like, yeah, you can share that your frustrations too. And just if there's, a reason that people do give, like, oh yeah, we all are taking this other course and we just had a test in that and it went really badly, you can take some time to acknowledge that and be like, yeah, that really sucks. I'm sorry that happened. You can adjust your material if you need to, if people are really just not here for it. So I think you can ask. That's the best way. Again, in a non-judgmental way, just be like, how are you folks doing? And you can give them resources to deal with that. As well, if you notice an individual student who sort of used to come but hasn't been coming anymore, or like hasn't downloaded videos in a while, I don't think there's anything wrong with sending them an email and just being like, hey, notice that you haven't been in class the last couple of times. How are you doing? And again, that only works if your class is small enough to know who's missing, or if you have some kind of attendance that you're keeping track of. That might be a really nice thing. Sometimes all it takes is someone reaching out a hand in compassion for a student to be like, ooh, yeah, actually, I do need some help, or something like that. So I think that's super, super important. It's so much easier in person, but I think you should make an effort to at least try to reach out if students are struggling. Question 10, I already did. 11, in online learning assessment, checking students' answers one by one may take a lot of time. How do you assess students effectively? So yeah, like I said, make liberal use of multiple choice, multiple select, and true false questions that can be auto-graded, or short answer even. Like short answer questions, they can be really quick to grade, even if it needs a human to look at it, but those can be really quick. And then if you have a large class, if you have an assessment where you do want to have some full solution questions, maybe mix it up. Instead of having like 7 full solution questions, maybe you have 3 full solution questions, or 4, maybe even 3. And then the rest of it is tested with auto-graded things, because that will, again, take some workload off your plate. Another, again, idea is that idea of peer assessment. So if you're comfortable with the idea, if you can give students a good rubric and say, evaluate each other's submissions on this rubric, and then you can give them each other's assessments to grade, and then maybe you can validate every so often. But that's one other thing. You can harness the power of your own students. Similar to the previous question, do you have any suggestion of how to assess a theoretical materials? Yes, I usually create an essay, different sets of questions, but it took a very long time to grade. Yes, very true. So one thing you could do with that is have a slightly more closed-ended type of question. So what I will usually do instead of an essay, which is a really valuable tool, like it's a very valuable assessment technique, but you're right, it's very difficult to grade. I might say, instead of writing a whole essay, write me an executive summary. So write me a 1-page memo or something. So I like to have students do work with Excel, and then they don't have to submit their Excel, they have to submit their 1-page memo, which is something they might have to do in the workplace. So have them put a very strict limit on how much they can submit, and so they have to make every word count. So that might be a little bit easier. It's easier to grade a 1-page memo than an essay of however long. So yeah, it's really tough because, again, sometimes a fully fleshed out essay is really a valuable thing and you want them to do that, especially if it's a high level course. and you want them to develop their research skills and their research writing skills. One other thing you could do for that, if it is, again, a high-level course where long form writing is one of your learning goals, is you could have some kind of peer review process. So you have each student create a draft and then put them either in pairs or groups of 3 maybe, and then they each evaluate each other's essays, give them feedback on it, and then they submit a second draft. And so they can get evaluated on, like, by their peers, and also on the feedback, the quality of the feedback that they gave to each other. And then you are just kind of sort of doing like a second grading, just making sure that nobody's completely off the mark in terms of how they're grading, so it doesn't take as long. Those are my suggestions. It's tough. It does take time to do that kind of thing. Are there any specific applications or websites that the instructors at the Department of Statistics and Actuarial Science used? Not with any kind of standard. Everyone did their own thing. So there are, I think you might be talking about the idea of like a lockdown browser or something like that, where, you know, it's like software that like stops students from looking at other websites while they're doing the test. Nobody used anything like that. They don't work, basically. If anyone with any amount of tech savvy could circumvent that. And what it does, they're so invasive, it basically treats people as guilty before they're proven innocent, which I don't think is the right message we want to be sending our students. So for those kind of midterms and finals, nobody in our department anyway used anything like that last term or this term. I'm not sure if some people might be trying it out for the fall, but I would be hesitant to suggest that. If you want to, go for it. There's lots. I don't Google it. I don't know. But I would suggest, rather than trying to focus on like stopping people from cheating and watching them like a hawk, you create the conditions in which cheating is not as likely to happen. By all of those things that I mentioned before. One thing that we have done in the Masters of Axi program is we just have people on a Zoom call during the test, not to like watch what they're doing, but so that they can ask questions if they have questions. So that's what we've done. Like, we can't see their screen, so they might be looking at something on it. I don't think they are. I think honestly that the entire MAXI class and all the MAXI students that are in the audience right now were great and put a lot of effort into their coursework without cheating. But we had us all just on a call so that people could ask questions if they had any. So that might be something that you could do. Is multiple choice question a good assessment for actuarial students? Because randomized questions will take a lot of time to examine if it's not a multiple choice question. I'm not sure I understand. I'm sorry. So I guess what I mean is, I'm going to guess what you mean, and if not, then you can ask. When you have a multiple choice question, you can randomize like the order of the answers within the question, but still have it auto grade. Like, you don't need to like manually grade them all. So I think definitely some multiple choice questions are a good idea. Oh, I think I know what you mean. Sorry. Maybe. Sorry. Yeah, if you change the numbers in a long answer question, then there's going to be lots of different right answers that might be difficult to mark. But again, you don't need lots of different versions of the question. Like, you could just have 2 or 3 versions of each question, and then if it's multiple choice, again, it can be auto graded. If it's not multiple choice and it needs human grading, then there's only like 2 or 3 different solutions that they have to keep in mind while they're marking. So it doesn't take much longer than having one version. 15, oral exam is new for me. My senior at ITB only uses to give a second chance if a student fails. Oh yeah, that's a really fine way of doing things as well. So I definitely have thought about using oral exams in that way. So if a student does poorly on a test or an exam, then rather than just failing them or, you know, making them take the whole course over again, you can give them an oral follow-up exam. So you can have them come in, whatever, talk to you a week later, say, or some amount of time later, and you can ask, have them study the particular material that they did poorly on, and then ask them some questions about that material. I think that's a fabulous, fabulous use of an oral exam. You can also do that too, even if they didn't do poorly. In fact, you know, if they did suspiciously well on a question or on an exam when you weren't expecting them to, you can just say, all right, let's do an oral follow-up exam. Can you walk me through your solution for this question? Or how did you come to this answer? Can you explain this to me? Because it's really easy to tell if someone is saying something that they don't really understand. So I think that's a great, great use of oral exams. And again, you can use it for people who did poorly. You could have it be opt-in, so students can choose to do an oral exam if they are unhappy with their mark, or you can choose who gets it either randomly or based on whatever criteria you like. Cool idea. All right, 16. Some of students get a very basic problem in learning course, something like they don't have good internet connection. Yes, that's a really good point. So we have to be thinking about the restrictions that our students have, and some don't have a really good internet connection. So for that, obviously asynchronous tools are best, and that's kind of nice because pretty much all of the things I've suggested can work asynchronously. So if a student has an assessment that is delivered through the online system, they could download it or print it off or whatever, and then complete it, and then just log back on and upload it and send it to you. So they don't need to be online for the entire time that they're doing the assessment. If it's any kind of peer grading thing, you wouldn't necessarily require them to work on it synchronously. If they can log on for a little bit, download those two people's assessments, or sorry, two people's questions that they have to evaluate them offline, type up their comments, log back in, send off the two comments to the two people, and then that's it. So as much as possible, letting things be something that they can log on, grab, log off, do, and then log back on and submit is ideal. So that's what I would suggest for that kind of thing, something they don't have to be online the whole time. That includes the delivery of the course material, but also those assessments. Thanks for the question. All right, I have gone 15 minutes over, so I feel like I should stop taking up all of your valuable time. Thank you so much for all your fabulous, insightful questions. I am going to stop sharing my screen. Oops. Oh, here's my last slide. So there's my email and there's my website. If you would like, I'm going to post a bunch of links for all of the tools that I talked about in my talk today. I'll post it there in the next couple of days. It's not ready quite yet, but very soon. So please go check that out. And I guess I'm done. Thank you again so much, Pak-Ik-san and Pak-Bill, for inviting me. And if you have any final housekeeping, you can go for it.
Okay.